forgot my card. Sorry. Take a seat. Welcome to the conference. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And it's a great pleasure and an honor for us to have you here as our guest. And first, I'd like to know more about, because you've got a super long and fruitful trajectory, but how did you end in games? Because that wasn't like a very common career path back then.
So I joined Sony Corporation, the electronics company, in 1986, straight out from college in Japan. And at that time, Sony was not making video games. Sony was making personal computers that play games, and I was a huge, video game fan. And I was thinking when I joined Sony, maybe in the future, Sony will make a video game. Just imagining. And it just so happened that, in 1993, 7 years after joining Sony, I was called in by my former boss at Sony that I should meet with this person named Ken Kutaragi. And at that time, I was working in a personal computer department, business group, helping the Apple computer. I don't know if you knew that Sony made the first portable Macintosh called PowerBook 100, the smallest one. Sony designed and manufactured on behalf of Apple computer. So I was in that group, interfacing with Apple people. But because my former boss in the corporate, knew that I was a big, huge video game fan, he wanted me to meet with Ken Kutaragi. So I went to meet Ken. And at that time, in 1993, Ken said that, sure, the Silicon Graphics workstation. That was used at the time to create the pre-rendered CGs for movies or TV commercials. He said, I'm making a video game system as powerful as Silicon Graphics workstation, and I'm going to sell it under $500. And I was like, wow, this person is lying. It's impossible. But being polite, I was like, oh, Kutaragi-san, that's amazing. And so I went back to my former boss and said, well, Ken is a liar, isn't he? And my former boss said that, no, I trust what Ken is saying. And I'm like, really? Can I join the group? So it turned out it was an interview. And luckily, I was able to join Ken's group. At that time, Ken has only the engineers making, the first PlayStation, and I was the first non-technical person to join the team because I didn't know that at that time the company was trying to move that project, Ken's project, from the R&D stage to the actual, business stage, and they started to assemble all different kinds of people. And it turned out 2 weeks after I joined the Ken's team, my former boss came as the head of the department. Oh. So he was assembling the people he knew he could use. And I was so lucky to join Ken's group in February of 1993. And I started talking to Japanese video game companies, trying to convince them to make games on PlayStation. And the company, Sony Computer Entertainment, was formed in the November of that same year, about 1 year before the launch of PlayStation. And at that time, the whole company was 80 people. And we had this celebration party in just one room in a hotel in Tokyo. And everybody was there. And I was given the ID number 32. Yeah, because they label from the very top, president and vice president and director, and I was like a manager level, so I was like a employee number 32. That's how I joined the PlayStation group. At that time, we were still making the system, and we are still trying to convince the Japanese publishers to Well, yeah, because we are based in Japan and so talking to Japanese publishers to make games on PlayStation. So.
How did it feel the first time you saw the PlayStation in motion? Because I was a kid back then, and it blew my mind. It like this is not possible.
Well,
what's going on here?
When I joined, the hardware was not done as yet. It was still in the development stage, and so I was shown like some simulated computer graphics, and I was explained by the top engineers in Ken's team how things work, and this is 3D graphics, but in real time, and yeah, so I was trying to imagine what it's gonna be like. But when the team started to make some demos, I don't know if you saw the dinosaur demo.
Yes.
It was like, oh my God.
That brings some memories.
Yeah, so that was really powerful when we were, visiting all, big and small companies in Japan to show the real-time, demo to convince that what we are making was real, not like a faked, like a 3D, looking
You
animation.
couldn't predict the future, but were you and the whole team aware that you had something big in your hands? Because there were a lot of new consoles coming back.
Yeah.
People don't remember them because they died as soon as they were born. But were you aware at some point that this is going to be big, this should work, this one should work?
Well, technically speaking, I couldn't believe what the team was making. Like Ken was, of course, exaggerating in when he compared to Silicon Graphics. The trick that the team made was to really reduce the resolution and be able to really focus on the computation into the, smaller number of pixels to make it real time. But yeah, we are all excited about the technology that the core team was making. However, everybody says that, the video game system is nothing unless you have a game, right?
Yeah.
Great game that take advantage of the system's capability. And because the PlayStation was like, 3D graphics system was totally different from how the video game system, arcade or consumer systems were made. So when we visit different companies, there are only a small number of companies who were doing the 3D games already on the arcade, like Namco, who understood what we are doing and were very excited and committed to make games on. All the other companies making, traditional like a 2D, background and the sprite kind of games were saying, there's no sprite, there's no background, how can we make games, right? And people are aware of the 3D games, but the genre was very limited to like racing games or shooter, like a space shooter. So they are like, 3D is great for racing or shooter, but maybe not the kind of games we are making, like RPGs. Or, so that was the challenge. So we are totally aware of the challenge, and we are coming from the consumer electronics company. And as you said, there are many other consumer electronics companies who tried and failed, right? And the video game publishers are very skeptical. And some people are very nice, but they said that, well, Sony, many companies failed. It's not easy to do video game.
Apple tried and failed, for instance. You mentioned Apple before.
Apple, yeah. And so, one publisher told us when we visited, come back when you have sold 1 million units of PlayStation. And that became our goal internally. And actually, the marketing department even created the TV commercial saying that we're going to sell 1 million units. That was the tagline. Yeah. And we did it. And we went back to the publisher.
How connected was the Japanese games industry back then with American, Europe? Because things had changed a lot. Internet wasn't that common back then.
Yeah.
So maybe at that point, it didn't feel like a worldwide effort. You were doing it more like for the Japanese market, and then you jumped to the rest of the world. Or from the get-go, you were doing it with the whole world in mind.
Well, if you know anything about Ken Kutaragi, Ken's vision is
He thinks
huge,
big,
right? And of course, he was looking at the global market because technologically speaking, no one else is doing something like PlayStation at the time for the consumer product. So of course, he had a huge ambition, but from business standpoint, we are like newcomers. We didn't have a strong lineup of titles at that point before the launch, other than like Ridge Racer. That was really key title. So practically speaking, selling 1 million units, within the first year or something like that was like our goal, like a business goal. So we are lucky that because we are part of Sony, we are subsidiary of Sony Electronics and Sony Music Japan, like two companies. We had a group company under Sony, so we quickly the branches were created in London and in the US. So we had a counterpart, not part of us, part of big Sony. So it was not like, kind of interesting relationship, but they had their own, business goals. But they had committed some resources to handle the launch in all, market. So we are from the beginning, looking at the global market.
Then the console came out. It was a massive success. New player when no one was expecting it, because you had like Nintendo, Sega, computers. That was it. Then suddenly you've got a new console on your hands in the market. And how were those first years? Because I guess it was super busy. Well, flying from one place to another.
Maybe people in the US or Europe at that time may not be aware that actually we struggled in Japan. The first year was great. Like I said, we quickly sold 1 million units, and we got commitment from most of the Japanese publishers. But we had the Sega Saturn as a competition, and Sega had a really strong second Christmas, the 1995, the second Christmas, that the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation launched, in December or November, December of 1994, the year before. And the first year was neck and neck, but the end of the year, second year, they had Virtua Fighter 2, and they had another game that was really, really strong. And we didn't have a strong lineup, so we were kind of struggling in Japan. But luckily, in the US and Europe, we had additional, strong titles, so the launch there went really well. But things all changed when I was in the third-party relations department, and we were able to convince Squaresoft. At that time, Squaresoft and Enix were a separate company, and Square had the Final Fantasy franchise, and Enix had the Dragon Quest franchise, and these two RPGs are the biggest, IPs in Japan.
Yeah.
And they were talking behind the scenes, that I cannot tell, but both of them committed to bring their new games on to PlayStation. That totally changed the fortune for us, and became, and I felt finally, we have the games that we needed to make PlayStation successful.
I have to take a pause on talking about your career, because you've said a lot about when we got these games, we didn't have these older games. And in the media and in social media, there's always lots of talks about the power of this new console or the memory, but at the end of the day, it's all about the games, right? It's always about the games.
Yeah.
But you made the machines, and you have to, right now your job right now is to sort of nurture indie developers to grow their games.
Right.
So you have always kept in mind, your job was always like, okay, we're selling machines, but it's all about the games.
Yeah. Well, so to to defend Ken's invention. So PlayStation, the original PlayStation as a hardware had two very strong attributes as a video game system. One is the real-time 3D graphics. So the software company, publishers making games, taking advantage of these tech could differentiate their games from other games in the market. So that's one. Another is we adapted CD-ROM media, and before PlayStation's generations, the older media was
cartridges.
Yeah, cartridges, and that was really expensive to make, and it took like 2 or 3 months, to when the publisher makes an order and receive the product. So publisher had to put up lots of money, millions of dollars, when they launch a large title, but they have to make a guess. If they oversell or overproduce the very expensive cartridges, they're gonna wipe out all the profit. And if they under forecast and manufacture only small number of units, when the game comes out and everything is sold, they have to wait for another 2 or 3 months. And by that time, the demand might have, people might have moved on to something else. So it was really, really risky business from software publisher standpoint. And that was the entry barrier for the, companies who are interested to come in to, make and publish games. So these two attributes really helped kind of democratize the game publishing business, and many new entrants came in. Like, From Software is one of the top publishers and the game creators of today. They are doing software business. But the president of at the time, Mr. Jin, was a huge video game fan, and he wanted to make video games. So the CD-ROM system allowed him to, this is the system that we can make games and publish. So PlayStation hardware actually helped the software companies, like a new company like From Software, or the company like Namco, who has a 3D graphics capability, to be very successful. But going back to your original comment, yes, without games, hardware is nothing. People don't buy for hardware.
But you've raised an interesting point. That decision from the hardware team of using CD-ROMs made developers' life easier. Yeah. That's something that we've seen also across the lifetime of PlayStation as a console. When the consoles were more approachable, their success was faster. The PS2 was, I'm not a developer myself, but I've heard it was comparatively easy to work with. People struggled at first with PS3, then PS4 went back to an easier architecture. When you're designing or you're promoting a console between developers, you have to think of all that potential, right? You have to create a potential for developers to use.
Yeah. So that was a huge challenge, when we launched PS3. Some of the people here were with us. It was so difficult to make games on PS3 because the architecture was so unique and nothing like that. On one hand, it's great to have this, very strong, 3D capability. PS1, PS2, PS3, compared to other systems available at that time, was very powerful. And Ken's approach was, top engineers can overcome any technical hurdle. That's true.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah, they can, but it doesn't mean that, everyone can have a good time or efficient time making games on, right? So PS1, PS2, luckily, most of the developers were able to overcome the challenges, but PS3 was so difficult that the company had to completely change the approach, So Ken moved on, and Kaz Hirai, was the head of the SCEA, at that time became the president of Sony Computer Entertainment. succeeding Ken. And that was right after the launch of PS3, because PS3 was so hard. And usually when a system launches, the engineering team move on to the next project. And so Kaz took over the company and wanted to totally change the approach from, technologically advanced, difficult to make games kind of approach to technologically, okay, but very easy to make games on, system, and moved the architecture to pretty much PC-like architecture. So anyone who's making games on PC are familiar with the architecture. And in addition, Kaz wanted the software team, game team, studios, first-party teams' input into the designing of the hardware itself. So I was head of the worldwide studio. Kaz made me that. So Kaz asked me to move from the US. I was in the US at that time. In 2008, Kaz asked me to move back to Japan to work with the hardware group. The hardware team started two projects, PS Vita project and PS4 project, in parallel. And so we, company, asked Mark Sony to join as the, lead architect of both of the systems. And my role was to, when hardware teams comes up with a question, there are many different, technological options to adapt to new system like PS Vita or PS4, and my role was to connect the right game team to the hardware team to discuss, what's the best option, and ask hardware team to make a prototype, and get that prototype into the hands of the game teams, and the game teams makes a prototype game, and share that result and discuss what works well and what's working and what's not working. So that's how the PS Vita, PS4, and new controllers, DualShock 4 features were designed. So that was a really, really key, big change, moving from, supercomputer-like peaky hardware architecture approach, which worked very well, during PS1, PS2 time, to more, familiar architecture to the game software developer, starting with PS Vita and PS4.
I'm seeing a pattern in the stories you're telling that a lot of your career has been acting as a diplomat between technical people and game creators.
Yeah, because I'm not a game creator myself. So my role is to look at all the parts of the company and how things could work, how best the things could work, and look at the strengths and weakness of the company and think about, this is the area we should focus on to make the PlayStation stronger. So I was doing, producing, games. So I was looking at things from producers' perspective.
Going back in time a little bit, when you were appointed vice president, what were your responsibilities back then? Because it was also, history of video games, it's always a turmoil time. But it was also in a key turning point for the story of PlayStation.
So when I joined Ken's team and started evangelizing the PlayStation, I was a part of the third-party relations team. And in 1996, right after we got Squaresoft to announce Final Fantasy VII, I had the opportunity to move to the game development as a producer. So, and your question about the VP of game development.
Yes.
So I was making games in Japan between 1996 to 2000, and I got the opportunity to move to the US because the head of game development in the US during PS1 time was moving on. So Kaz Hirai was the head of SCA at the time, so Kaz was looking for the replacement, and he asked me to move over to the US to succeed. So that was the VP of game development. So it was very interesting time. Up to PS1 days, Japanese game industry, software industry was doing very well. Making lots of leading, games like Final Fantasy or Metal Gear Solid or Capcom's, action games, well respected throughout the industry. And so I was part of the industry, Japanese industry. So when I was moving to the US in year 2000, I was like, I'm gonna bring the, art of making games from Japan to the US. But soon after, I learned how connected the US software industry was, like GDCs, and people move, between companies, and people share the knowledge and, even technologies. And quickly, I saw the US games quality go up, and even I was very proud of how well polished some of the Japanese games are. Even top US teams learning how things have to be done to really polish the game. So we are all excited about the new God of War game came out last week. But the first game that I think surprised the whole industry, including Japanese published software industry, was our launch of the first God of War in 2005. And many people said that, well, this feels like a Japanese game. The game had a spectacle, great graphics, but how the game felt was different from the past image of Western games that we are talking. So soon after I moved to the US, I stopped looking at new Japanese games. Every E3, I learned to some Japanese, like Nintendo booths or to check out the new game, but I stopped doing it, and because there are so many exciting games being created in the US and European, community during that PS2 period.
Over the years, when you got appointed then as head of the whole thing, and you had to oversee PlayStation as a whole, you somehow missed being closer to the games and to the players?
If I missed being close to the...
Yeah, in the sense that you had to oversee the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. So during PS1 time, I was a producer of games like Crash Bandicoot or Ape Escape, Legend of Dragoon, like a hands-on, making games. And it was really fun and very close to the consumers, like you're saying. I was in every play testing sessions and looking at the games with our, game designers and discuss, what have to be changed. But when I moved to the US and became head of the department, and there are several studios underneath, and Santa Monica Studio, San Diego Studio, several other studios. Like you are saying, my involvement to each product has to be much less. So like starting a project, checking out the progress, and sometimes finishing, canceling project, or making decision on how much more time the game needed, and sometimes have to push out, or not sometimes, almost all the time.
All the time.
Almost all the time, have to make that decision. And every time we did, marketing and business side complained to us, and but in the end, company understood the importance of the quality of the game, and we are so fortunate that the company in the end trusted our judgment. They gave us enough time and resource to be able to tell the business that yes, we are ready. So I was still involved in that, like key moments. So I didn't feel I was too away from development. And I was checking. I'm a huge believer of playtesting. I am So I was checking closely how the testing goes, because that really tells, game looks like finished, right? But when the players are not enjoying your game, you have to spend more time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really critical decision the management of the studios have to make. So I was involved in that conversation.
What would you say have been the most important, the most critical decisions you've taken in your career? That's a tough one.
Critical? What the word mean, critical?
Like turning points in your career, in the story of your company, where you had to take a difficult decision, a challenging decision?
Well, there are certain times, looking back, I wish I had courage to stop project earlier, or yeah. But I'm very optimistic kind of person, and so I tend to forget the bad things. And
I don't mean necessarily bad things, though. It can be good decisions, but
good decisions.
Crossroads where you think this would have been very different if I had done something else, which doesn't mean that your decision was a bad one. You say, for instance, the moment when you went to coordinate the efforts with PS4 and Vita, that's a critical decision in the story of the company.
Well, in hindsight, it worked really well. The other thing I felt I did well was to connect the studios. Yeah, so we had, when I was managing first party, we had like 13, 14 studios, in US, Europe, and Japan. And I tried to form the culture that studios kind of trust each other and talk with each other. So every year, twice a year, during the GDC week and right after E3, these are the times, many studio people come to the location, San Francisco and Los Angeles, naturally. So we set up additional internal event around these two big video game events. And studios talk to each other, presented what they are working on, what the new approach or new tech that they developed, or what are the problems they encountered. So doing that over many years really created this trust between different studios. So I talked about the conversation between studios and hardware teams, but before that function, we had this culture of between inter-studios communication, and that really helped to organize information to the hardware team as well. So that I was very proud that I was able to make an impact. And each product, we are so fortunate to have very talented people in studios. So the quality of the titles that the PlayStation published first party are really coming from these creative minds. So we are just lucky, and my role was to support them.
Then at some point you moved to indie games, to developing relations with indie games. How did it feel, the change? Because it's quite a change of pace, I guess.
Absolutely. So it was November 2019, like just 3 years ago. So I was doing the president of Worldwide Studios over 11 years at the time. And Jim Ryan was like, let's move the studios to the new generations, and he offered me this new role. He created this new role to support indies, because at that time, at the launch of PS4 period, PlayStation was seen as the place to enjoy indie games, and the indie developers we supported very well. But toward the latter part of the generation, PS4 generations, somehow the company's focus looked like we are promoting more first party and AAAs, and so I was on the receiving end of that focus
Yeah.
to support first-party titles. So, but I was a huge indie game fan myself. That I had shared that concern of if we are losing, focus from supporting smaller developers. So when Jim offered the new role, I was like, yes, I want to do it. And video game development has become so large, the AAA titles takes hundreds of people, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years to make. So it was, amazing, job for me to manage these studios, but it was a kind of slow process. But indie games, there are hundreds of games, thousands of games, like on Steam, 10,000 games get released, in a year, right? So there are so many games, and there are so many, not only PC, but even on PlayStation, there are so many developers making games. So we have a large global organization called Third Party Relations, which I work very closely with. And we have a global team of account managers and portfolio teams looking at the games in development all the time. So I just joined the activities, and I have this fortune of meeting with developers and receiving the games in development and give them some feedback, or sometimes join the conversation to make decision on the games to partner with. Certain number of titles, third-party relations strike a deal to bring game to PlayStation as a limited console exclusivity or something like that. So the pace that you mentioned is totally different. Every day, if I want, I can try new games in development. It's really, really fun to do.
This is a personal position I've got, but I feel that indie games from 6-7 years to today are where the innovation in game design happens. Then that translates to AAA over the years, or AAA is where the technical innovations happen, but you can experiment with a smaller game that doesn't have a 100 million budget. Do you share that view? Is that the appeal of indie games for the audience? Like, this is a small polished gem where you are going to see new things?
Well, yeah, definitely. It's one of the attraction of the indie games, and could be the most important aspect of indie games for the whole industry. Like you're saying, spending over $100 million to make just one game, the publishers cannot take too much risks, like works on a genre that didn't exist or something like that. So the smaller teams, many of them make games because they believe in things. They don't have to go through the approval process or like that. Well, they have to pitch games sometimes to get funding, but still, indie publishers want games that developers believe in making. Not, they don't want to be asked, what their publisher is looking for. So when the small number of people, creators, believe in something, even that doesn't exist, maybe because something that doesn't exist, they want to make that game for themselves. And that creates a totally new game mechanic, or sometimes even new genre, right? The whole new era of gaming. Even one game could change the landscape, like Battle Royale came out from the indie scene. So that's really, really the fun aspect of indie games, to play something that I never played. So I was checking out the games on the expo today, and one of the games has really new game mechanic. I'm a huge action game fan, but this game, you don't attack enemy. You have to use enemy's attack to deflect or to be able to fight with the enemy. Really new feel. That's so great. Yeah. So these ideas come from these smaller teams. And that's really the fans of playing new games. And that's honestly what I and many members of our third-party relations team are looking for from indie scenes, something that we have never seen or tried before.
We've seen a change of pace in the approach of not just Sony, other companies too, about indies. In the case of Sony, we've seen indie games taking the stage on E3 and all the big events in the Tokyo Game Show. You're promoting them now on PS Plus and in the main front page of the PlayStation Store. What would you say are the key changes you've implemented in the approach of your company towards indie games?
Well, in terms of the digital store, the majority of the business, software business, are now, done digitally, and the share of the digital business is growing every year. So it's in the physical games won't go away because there are always, customers who love, collecting these, physical products, and developers and publishers, do a good job of adding some, extra niceties to these physical packages. So they won't go away, but the digital business become really, important, and many indie games are released only, on digital. So it's really important and a responsibility for the platform company like ourselves to be able to surface really good games in the eyes of consumers, even though the digital storefront, in theory, can have unlimited shelf space, but it doesn't mean that we have unlimited space to showcase titles. So it's really important for our digital store team, and I work with the store team and the third-party relations team to discuss and try to identify games before they come out, which games to be featured on the store. That will help, on the other hand, consumers, because there are so many games come out every week. Not everybody is hardcore gamers looking for information on the internet. People just go to the store and maybe look at the games on the storefront. So it's really, really important for us to keep making the discoverability of games on the PlayStation Store better, and be able to showcase the games to each person, because in theory we know everyone's taste, right? Because we know which games you purchase on the store, which games you spend a lot of time. So we should be able to show each customer the best upcoming games that we believe you would be interested. So it doesn't have to show the biggest titles to everyone all the time. That's kind of boring, storefront.
Okay. We've got a few minutes, and I'd like to open the microphone for the audience in case they have a question. If not, I do have more, so we can continue. So there's a question. There's hands over there. You can hand them a microphone, please. Por aquí. Si alguno queréis hacer la pregunta en español y que yo la traduzca, no hay problema. Just telling them that I can translate for them if they want to speak in Spanish.
Check. Congratulations on your award, Yoshida-san. It is really nice that you reminded of the dinosaur demo for the PSX, and that's really legendary for PlayStation fans. And another thing that had a dinosaur demo, if I'm correct, was the Project Morpheus, which then became the PSVR. So I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about VR in general, and how excited are you about PSVR 2 coming really, really soon?
How I'm feeling about PSVR 2? Is that your question? I'm super excited.
Excited.
Yeah, well, VR is I was heavily involved in the making of PSVR. Like I explained, Kaz Hirai put me in the position to bridge between the hardware and software teams. And actually, PSVR project came from as a grassroots work from multiple studios, like Santa Monica Studios used the God of War on PS3 to create the handmade VR system. That was really inspirational when I tried it. I was a Kratos. It's unbelievable. Yeah, so VR, for the first time, the video game world is not behind the screen. It's, surrounding you. And PSVR and the first one, and Oculus Rift and, Valve system, these are the first generation of consumer VR systems were just enough, good enough to make it comfortable and enjoyable. But we all knew that with more resolutions, with more power, with more interactivity, everything, technically speaking, should be and will be improved. Because of the console life cycle, we waited. The launch of PSVR was 2016, so we announced the launch of PSVR to next year. So it's 7 years. We waited, for 7 years to release the new experience. And the challenge of VR systems is, unless you try it, you really don't understand. So, of course, people in the company, we've been using it, and we know how great it is to be inside the world of Horizon, and you look up, and these tall necks walk behind you. So I cannot wait to have more people try it. It's very limited at this point. Even journalists are limited. Only limited number of people have tried it. So I'm looking forward to get more people try PSVR 2 and start writing about it, talking about it, so that everybody have a better idea what we are bringing to the market.
Thank you. ¿Había alguna pregunta ahí atrás también?
First of all, thank you for the talk. I found it super interesting. You discussed how important it is for new hardware to have games already developed when it's coming out. So I wanted to ask you how Sony handles talking to developers before, for example, PlayStation 1 was developed. You have to have developers to develop a game for a console that is not finished. So how do you do that? And I don't know if my question is, did you understand the question?
Can you?
Si me puedes repetir en...
que como...
Yeah, there's an echo, so...
es que hay bastante eco aquí arriba, entonces
vale,
no oímos muy bien.
La pregunta es que cómo se hablan con los desarrolladores antes de que la consola salga y con cuánto tiempo de antelación para que cuando la consola salga ya tengan los juegos producidos.
Vale. How are the talks between you, or between a platform, and the developers before a console comes out? And how long those talks can happen? I mean, if you need a year for you to pitch the platform to these developers, or 2 years, 3 years, just a few months?
Oh, like when we launched PS5 or PSVR 2.
Or so the PSX, like
PlayStation
how's that process?
1. Yeah, so PlayStation 1, so we started pitching to Japanese publishers in 1993, like right after I joined Ken's team, and we launched PS1 December of 1994. So it was about 2 years before, but at that time we didn't even have a prototype hardware to show. So it was a simpler time, smaller games, simple system. Games were being made, in 1 year or so by small number. So that was the time. But now it's much more complex, big, games. So, developers would need more time if they are to start from scratch. But in many cases, especially moving from PS4 to PS5, the architectures are similar. So it's, I believe, the developers have the easiest transition when you are making or you experience making games on PS4, making games on PS5 is a really smooth transition. So it wouldn't have needed a long time to before the launch. However, making games take much longer these days, so that's a different story.
Tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta. Había una por ahí para el fondo, perdón. Sí.
Well, first of all, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I would like to ask, where would you draw the line in your experience between what would be an indie game and what would be a AAA game?
You mean the bound, ¿qué los diferencia?
Sí.
What would you say is the difference between an indie and a AAA game? Because the boundary can be blurry at these times.
Well, yeah. So I would say indie game is indie game when the developers believe they are making an indie game.
Okay.
Yeah. So the other way to say is indie games is great because the developers have complete creative control. So there are many bigger indie studios, like some studios have 50 people already well funded, but still, as long as they have the indie spirit, I think we can call that indie games. I was reminded in one of the interviews I took, I explained the line between indie games and not indie games could be when the Fall Guys was launched, it was indie game. But nowadays, Epic Games put a lot of resources to the developers, and probably we won't call Fall Guys indie game anymore. So somewhere in between, there's a line.
So before we go, this is an indie conference. It's a conference for indie developers.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you if you have some words of inspiration, some piece of advice you want to share with the developers attending the conference.
Yeah. Well, I have been fortunate to go to many an industry event with awards, and these days, almost every award have indie games as a finalist of the Game of the Year, and in many cases, when I was managing first parties, our games were beaten by indie games, to take the best Game of the Year awards. So that's the power of indie games. Compared to other form of entertainment, there are indies in music or movies, but the impact that indie game can have, even made by a small number of people or even one person anywhere in the world, could make a huge impact to the whole industry, and that could, generate a lot of revenue and reputations quickly. So it's such an amazing time that everybody is now in making games, and making games is hard, and there are so many people making games. So it's really hard to get your games being known by people, but still, I believe in the medium and I believe in the creativity of game developers. So I want you to keep trying.
Thank you very much. In my name and in the name of the festival of this conference, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for your whole career, for all that you have made for the games industry that we love so much. Without your career, without your decisions, without your work, the games industry wouldn't be the same, the history of games wouldn't be the same. I want to thank you in my name and in the name of the conference for what you're doing right now for indie games. And for all those reasons, it is an honor for us to present you with our honorary award for this year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Con todos ustedes, Shuhei Yoshida. Please walk with me.